Welcome to Left, Right, and Unwanted, the podcast where people across the political spectrum discuss ideas and politics. I'm Lauren, and I'm the left.
I'm Morgan, and I'm the right.
I'm Luke, and I'm the unwanted.
So everyone's heard, if a tree falls in the forest and no one hears it, does it make a sound? The question I would like to ask you today is, if you go to the pumpkin patch and do not post about it on Instagram, did you really go?
I think you went.
Yes, you went to the pumpkin patch, but yeah, does it count if all your followers don't know about it?
It's hard to go to the pumpkin patch without posting it to the internet. So I think most people would be in the camp saying, if you don't post about it, it doesn't even count, because chances are some people were going only for the content in the first place. So I think some of it has to do with why you're going in the first place. Are you there for an experience, or are you creating content of your own? Debord comes from, actually, he's one of the founding members of a branch of philosophy called situationism, and he's a proponent of situationist theory. And essentially what this is it's the idea that when humans move from experiencing something firsthand to then experiencing it by proxy, when that happens over and over again, it has negative implications for how people find meaning in their lives. And Debord, in Society of the Spectacle, introduces this experience through proxy in what he refers to as the spectacle. Today you could maybe refer to it as media in general or content even. And it's the idea that people can be controlled by the market economy, which controls the content and media accessible by people. The situationists say that the way to counteract the effects of the spectacle is by taking time to purposefully be and to experience life itself. This movement grew out of letterism, which was a movement about constructing things by their most basic elements. So as a letterist and then a situationist, Debord believes in seeing the world as a collection of experiences. And a lot of his essays deal with these big concepts that are boiled down to little moments of consumption. When I read this, I thought some of it felt like it could have been written even a couple years ago. Like a lot of what he talked about felt like it was still fairly applicable today.
I thought the same thing. I was like, a lot of this, if you think of it in terms of like social media and online presences and people creating content, then yeah, it could definitely apply.
When I hear people talking about the effect of social media and everything's fake now, typically they're not talking about Debord, they're talking about Baudrillard and like simulacra and simulation. My understanding is his is a more slotted as a postmodernist view of society, whereas Debord is still working within the modernist framework. Did anybody else read comments on the Society of the Spectacle?
Yes.
That was sort of his attempt to maybe make it in a more accessible version of Society of the Spectacle. And so in that, he actually specifically defines spectacle. He has it in a sentence definition as the autocratic reign of the market economy, which had acceded to an irresponsible sovereignty and the totality of new techniques of government, which accompanied this reign. And he says, rather than talk of the spectacle, people talk about the media, which is just a perfected instrument of the spectacle, its most glaring manifestation. And sometimes people mistake the media for the spectacle when the media is just one aspect of it.
Right. And I feel like that's probably because the media is the aspect of it that is the easiest for people to interact with. And it's probably the way most people consume and receive information, which is why it could look like it's the whole thing.
And he goes on to describe what he calls spectacular power. And originally there were two types. There were concentrated spectacular power, which is sort of the traditional totalitarian, fascist, Stalinist view of a government that all the power is concentrated in one entity that controls all of society. And the other side of it was something called diffuse, where not all the power is in one entity, but the power is driving wage earners to apply their freedom of choice to the new commodities. So sort of the idea of mass consumerism, where people think they have a choice, but really their choice is, what are they going to buy? And then he finally goes into a third, which is a combination of two previous ones, more closely related to the diffuse. He said it was pioneered by France and Italy with 5 features. There are 5 features that you could probably say are pretty present in the United States today. So the first is incessant technological renewal. There's a massive focus on the latest technology and getting that for private use. So if I think about, all the latest iPhone, which is just the previous iPhone, integration of state and economy, and all experts serve the state and the media.
Mm-hmm.
So, and he says you get expertise to sell goods. That's the whole point of getting it. So previously, maybe an expert in Etruscan art worked at a university or just sort of did it because they loved Etruscan art. And now they're an expert in Etruscan art, so they can value art pieces that are for sale. What was that show where you bring in your antiques and it was on PBS?
Antique Roadshow?
Antique Roadshow.
Yeah. So like before, maybe you just liked these things. Now you do it so you can put a price on it. Generalized secrecy, unanswerable lies, partly due to the destruction of history. So you can like totally change a person's past, like the Moscow trials or maybe present day cancel culture, where you can just say something about that person. They can't say anything back and they're just disappeared from society. And then the eternal present, where we forget about the past and we don't believe in a future. And I see this most clearly in our present day news cycles, where like, remember like Anthony Scaramucci, how like he was like all anyone was talking about for like 5 days and then he disappeared and like we just moved on to the next thing. Or like the kids in cages or Afghanistan, like whatever, like something was super important and it was the end of the world for like 10 days and then it's gone and it's like it never existed.
I feel like you could apply the eternal present to the ways these other items function as well. Because if you're operating in a state of being constantly in the present moment, like you said, with the past not really being alterable and the future not really existing, then does it really matter if you spread unanswerable lies about other people? Or does it really matter? If you need to have the latest technology, then the answer has to be now, right? So I think that too maybe kind of has an impact on the other factors.
Jumping back to the Society of the Spectacle. So his first thesis, he talks about in societies where modern conditions of production prevails, all of life presents itself as an immense accumulation of spectacles. Everything that was directly lived has moved away into a representation. One example that I think is helpful for understanding what he means by moved away into representation is brands. When you buy something, people care less now about its quality than the brand. Like if you buy sweatpants, people want to know, does it have the Nike swoosh label on it, not how comfortable are they, how long will they last, those kinds of things. It's more important what the symbol is on a product than what its quality is.
The other thing this made me think of is when you go to the furniture store and you look at all the display rooms and you can purchase the old looking fake books to put on your shelves. And then it's not like you really have the book, but you have a representation of the book because it communicates something to the people in your home. After establishing what he did in thesis 1, kind of the idea that everything is now more of a representation instead of the thing itself, all of these images merge together into a stream that he says in which the unity of that life can no longer be recovered. And he gets into the idea of fragmented views of reality. So all of these representations coming together, and eventually it becomes hard to separate it back out from what it used to be before.
I took that as him basically trying to talk about the concept of reification, a Marxist doctrine that, Marx sort of first used it, and then it was picked up by Lukács, and who talked about it a little bit more. If you think about yourself, you are like one whole person. You're a person, you're a whole, you're an integrated whole, but there's different aspects of you that in a market economy you can sell. So you can think about an athlete maybe sells his athletic ability, and those individual skills become broken out and separated from you and exist sort of independently of the integrated whole of your body. Aspects of ourselves are fragmented and sold on the marketplace, where they are then remerged into a different whole than the one that they were previously. So this includes like our for instance, maybe our relationships. So my friendship with people is now on Facebook, and Facebook now has that data, and then they can sell that data to, marketers and advertisers, or opinions that I hold. I can put those out on social media, and then they exist independently in the form of a tweet or a Facebook status post.
Well, and you can accumulate, different, I guess, images on different platforms if you post different things or put different things out there on, in this case, different types of social media. If you're not cross-posting everything, then you would appear different on each one. And then if somebody were to accumulate all those, you could get an even different view.
Right. Like if you use your Twitter account for your political views, and then you use your Instagram for all your travel pictures, people who are interacting with you on different platforms have a different view of that fragment of your personality, and they don't necessarily know the other half. One thing he says at the bottom of the second thesis is that the spectacle is a concrete inversion of life, an autonomous movement of the non-living. So whatever is happening with these images and these representations that are put out there isn't exactly within the control of the creator. So once somebody creates a brand, or once somebody posts a picture, the way that image or that thing fits into other people's lives and affects people isn't all the way within your sphere of influence anymore. Like once it's out there, you have a little control over the distribution, but the spectacle will move without human intervention. Like things will exist, things will continue to have an impact, even if you're not directly navigating how that occurs with your product. And 3, he says that the spectacle, the way it's presented, is as a means of unification. And I took that to mean it's something that is described as omnipresent, which means it's something everybody can take part in. So at first glance, you would see it as this unifier. It's something everybody can connect to. Everybody has access to it in some capacity, so it's an equalizer. But then he continues to say that since the spectacle is by definition separate and is not actually life, but is a representation of life, it really ends up creating delusions and separating people in the long run. So even though it seems like it could be this uniting force for everybody, ultimately, when it creates confusion and maybe some false representations, people end up more divided.
He talks about how it's the official language of generalized separation, and it's the sector which concentrates all gazing and all consciousness. So if you think about media, or more specifically the news, it's almost like if it's not on TV, it doesn't exist. So news stories, although I think this is actually breaking down more than it is gaining power with the advent of new media and alternate forms of news and things. I mean, when it was just 3 network channels that controlled all the news, it was easier to do this. And that kind of goes back to the eternal present. When he talks about it's the language that we use, we often compare our lives to media. And people will say things like, you're being such a Monica. And it's the language that we use to communicate is in the we would get it from the spectacle. It's not of our own creation. But this is really that different than 3,000 years ago, would Greek people be like, you're being such a Zeus right now? Is comparing our lives to commonly held stories in the zeitgeist really a new thing?
Oh, I don't think so. I definitely think people have always used, various cultural part of references and speaking. I mean, you see all sorts of old texts and stuff that people who are working on them were writing notes and margins, or, various graffiti from, super long ago. So, and look at it kind of in modern terms, it's all, also stuff that we would do. So I don't doubt that, people would be like, somebody's being a man whore, you're being such a Zeus right now.
Maybe the difference is what is possible in terms of connecting to stories like that. Like if I send a GIF to my coworkers or to my husband or something, I don't have to know what the context is in order for it to work. Like I've sent people things from shows I've never seen because it fit what I was trying to say. So, I mean, is it the idea that you can still find connection to it and you can still connect to something even if you're not familiar with what it is you're sharing, but you're using it to make a point in a conversation? I guess when he talked about the fact that it ultimately creates division, that part I did agree with. And it could be as simple as getting back to Luke's example with the different brands. Like if everybody in your friend group has the same Nike shorts, Morgan, I'm thinking about the ones that came out when we were in 6th or 7th grade that everybody had.
That I still have like 500.
Yes, exactly. It becomes very obvious if you're one of the people who doesn't. And it's a pretty clear line of separation in the people that, you know, are following whatever is being followed at the time and the people who either can't or won't or don't have the means to. Because I didn't get my fancy shorts until May. And I think they'd already been floating around my school for almost the entire year at that point.
I think that sort of example sort of flows into number 4, where he talks about this spectacle is not a collection of images, but a social relation among people mediated by images. And this idea of how the images can affect our relations with each other and separate us into groups, put people in and out groups. I mean, what bands do you like? What brands do you wear affects our perceptions of others, as well as the role that you play in society also affects your perspective of others. You know, he's a garbage man versus he's a surgeon. You just sort of have different attitudes toward people based on that. But my question to this then is, how is this different from like a caste system, for example, in, you know, sort of Brahmin India, where they had specifically divided roles in a society that were conveyed by various images associated with each person? Is that really a new phenomenon to the post-industrial West? Or do humans just like assigning into groups?
I mean, I've seen various things where people point out, okay,
an image that divides people into in and out groups.
Sorry, you're right. It was more just the fact that you
or circumcision.
You're
or
right. You're not wrong.
Not where my brain was going.
A shibboleth of any kind.
But I mean, I've seen where people, debate. Do we like to put people in groups, or is it, you know, just that we can't help but try to find patterns and orders and order in everything, and that leads to how can we kind of clump different things together, or, you know, minimize, you know, try to put some order into things.
The thing I thought of when I read this was tattoo inspiration. Like when people take inspiration for tattoos they want from things other people have already gotten. And I guess I don't know why it made me think of this, but I guess it's the idea, like people have Pinterest boards dedicated to this. And really you're taking something you're going to put on your body to express yourself, but you're basing it off of something somebody else already put on their body. And they probably pulled it off of somebody else's Pinterest board. So are you really expressing yourself the way you mean to, or is your tattoo just a distillation of somebody else's original design from, you know, 10 Pinterest boards back? You know, people who get them and then they're like, well, this represents me. It's very personal to me, but I also found it on the internet and I'm sure 20,000 other people have the same one.
The spectacle cannot be understood as an abuse of the world of vision, as a product of the techniques of mass dissemination of images. It is rather a Weltanschauung, which has become actual, materially translated.
Did he use the German? Does that mean he used the German in the original, I wonder?
Probably.
Yeah. And mine, I don't know, like has a sentence reordered. So it is a worldview that has actually been materialized, that has become an objective reality.
So yeah, The spectacle in thesis 5 is described as a Weltanschauung, which we now know is a worldview, which is now part of mass reality. He also gets in the 6th one into the idea that there are choices that have been predetermined. So, and we touched on this toward the beginning of our discussion, that even though you have maybe the illusion of choice, or you have a couple different options, most commodities nowadays, it's one or the other and there's no middle ground. Like Jif or Skippy peanut butter are kind of the two big ones. And you can choose which one you buy. You're still buying peanut butter, which is produced in virtually the same way. You can maybe choose whether you want to buy it from Walmart or Target, but they're selling the same things for nearly the same price. So we do have choices, but the choices have already been set up by companies. He kind of closes 6, but after going through the idea of the predetermined choices, it says that it justifies the constant presence because it kind of also dictates how you spend your time when you're outside of the production process. So I took this to mean the way the spectacle functions, it sets up all of these images that are part of the mass consciousness. And then within the system, you now have certain choices that, while they may seem to be endless, have already been determined by companies, brands, or businesses. And based on your role in the system, and with these choices that you have, your time is already kind of spoken for when you're off the clock, not at work. There are probably only certain things you could do with your time, depending on how much money you make, where you live, and what there is available to you. So
Right.
Even your time isn't really always your own choice.
Right. So he's coming from the perspective that the working class has been commodified, and it has to become conscious of the fact that it has become commodified to develop a revolutionary consciousness. And so he sees the spectacle or consumerism, maybe more specifically, as sort of a new opiate of the masses, rather than religion in Marx's day, keeping people focused on a world other than the one they actually live in. Nowadays, the spectacle keeps people focused on a world other than the one that they actually live in. They live in the world of The Office, or they live in the world of Parks and Rec. And because these particularly shows and media, but other forms of consumerism as well, because those govern all the time that people spend outside the production process, it distracts them from thinking about the production process itself with the spectacle, and it keeps the masses pacified from developing this class consciousness.
And that also refuels the spectacle itself. It's more shared experiences, it's more images, it's more time spent consuming all of these things.
If you're wanting a great mass of people to not want this, I think you're going to be pretty disappointed, because most people want to be kept safe, well-fed, and amused. I think a large part of the population likes bread and circuses, and they always will, because some people are just better than others.
And I don't know if it's just because of the new Matrix trailer, but my brain kept jumping to the Matrix when I was reading this. The idea of you have everything set up, everything decided for you, and then it kind of ties into like what Luke was just talking about. Would you just be content taking what you're given, kind of not pushing it too much, as long as you're happy? And
like Cypher.
Yes.
Cypher is the guy who he knows the truth, but then once he knows the truth, he doesn't want to know anymore. He wants to go back to the Matrix and be happy and eat steak in fancy restaurants.
I was about to say that. Yeah. Which, yeah.
And how many people would also make the same choice? I think a majority of people.
Yes.
Sorry, comrade.
We're getting super meta right
now.
The
Matrix. I kept thinking about Sims the entire time I read this. That's what stuck out to me. Or even games that some of my kids play. Almost like the game of life kind of. That jumped out to me when I read this. Like you're going around the life board.
We're all
and
on
everything's
our path.
Yeah, and it's all set in the cards. And there's
Very
only
Loki.
a select number of outcomes you can have.
sacred timeline. Everything's decided for us.
So it says separation is itself part of the unity of the world, of the global social praxis split up into reality and image. So if you think about our lives, so we have like our real lives where we actually go and do work and we labor and all those things. And then we have the spectacle where we're not really aware of the fact that we're the boss man stealing our labor, as the Marxists would say. But the fact that these two separate things exist at one time is the whole reason it works. It's part of the unity, because if there wasn't actual production going on, then the spectacle would break down. But on the other hand, if people were aware of the reality of production, then the spectacle would also break down, because people would develop this class consciousness. So both have to exist at once to sustain the spectacle.
Yes, we can't have one without the other.
And the spectacle, and then so the language of the spectacle consists of signs of the real in production. So again, we talk in terms of, for instance, your harmonica. I went to a party, it was just like super bad, dated reference, but which they're at the same time the ultimate goal of the production. So the spectacle speaks in the language, but the spectacle is also producing shows. So the shows that we use as language are also the end goal of the spectacle. So the language is also the end goal. And so it's a cycle. So that sort of feeds into 8, where he says one cannot abstractly contrast the spectacle to actual social activity. Such a division is itself divided. Or before it was 2 halves, there was reality and image. Now it's really like there's 4 quadrants. So there's the spectacle that exists within reality, and the reality that exists within reality, the spectacle that exists within the spectacle, and the reality that exists within the spectacle. All of these have to, it can't be completely bifurcated, because then it would also break down. There has to be a complete mixture of all the aspects. The real and the spectacle each has aspects of reality and image, is what my notes say. So he says lived reality is materially invaded by the contemplation of the spectacle, while simultaneously absorbing the spectacular order, giving it its positive cohesiveness. Objective reality is present on both sides.
So it's incredibly hard to entangle it from reality, because there's so much overlap in where reality exists now as a result of the spectacle. Complete opposed opposites. There's a little bit of gray area mixing on both sides. He really just finishes that thought in 9 by saying, in a world that has really been turned upside down, the true is a moment of the false.
This is sort of a reversal of Hegel, who says, we cannot say the false is a moment of the true, because a falsehood has an aspect of truth to it. So if I say, Morgan murdered Autumn, we can't say that has an aspect of truth to it, because, for instance,
I would murder Luke first.
For instance, it presumes Morgan and Autumn are both real people. So there, even in falsehoods, there are truths present there. So even the false has moments of truth in it. And he's sort of flipping that around, because these continental types love wordplay and referencing Hegel. It's sort of the 2 things they live for.
I guess the true has a moment of false could connect back to social media as well. Like when someone shares a happy picture of whatever's going on, and you don't see all the behind the scenes where we're all really the same, like everyone's running around forgetting things, and your house gets messy from time to time. But
you only post the positive things that you want other people to know about on social media.
And it's not that it's not true. You're just being selective about what you want other people to see about you. You're not lying. You're just leaving some things out.
So in number 10, he basically just says that this concept of the spectacle has great explanatory power. It can explain different social phenomena with one narrative. And the spectacle asserts that social life is mere appearance, but the spectacle is really the negation of life. And then number 11, he talks about how the spectacle is a totality. And because it's a totality, you have to make arbitrary breakdowns in order to explain it. And you're also stuck with using current language, which is necessarily shaped by the spectacle. So maybe a example or metaphor for this is history. When you're studying history, literally everything causes what comes next, and you can't really pull things out. And yet we still talk about the industrial age or the Middle Ages and things like that. And they're, to some extent, arbitrary distinctions, because the Roman Empire never really went away and things like that. But in order to understand something, you can't grasp it all at once. So you have to start in bits and pieces, even if they're arbitrarily chosen.
I mean, same for learning about even current events. If you're not up to speed on a certain situation, there's levels you kind of have to go through to know what's going on. And you have to introduce things in a certain order when you're learning something new, or content doesn't always make sense. This could even be taken for translations. Like if you're studying history or history of the spectacle or both, you have to understand what words meant in that day, in that context too, because language changes as we move forward. And there's plenty of things that had a completely different connotation in a different time period in history. And there's actions and gestures and other societal elements that today we take one way, but taken out of context in the past, you can get misunderstandings.
I want to commend you on your acceptance of the originalist view of interpreting the Constitution, Lauren. It's very, very good of you to come out in support of it.
In 12, the line that stood out to me the most is where he says, the sole message of the spectacle is what appears is good, what is good appears, which is a circular message. So if the spectacle shows what is good, it legitimizes itself. If people believe everything they observe in the spectacle to be good, then if something they create or they do or they're familiar with is then shown, they assume it to be good.
By making it seem like this is the only way to live, it implies that it's good and normal. It's sort of like if you go to, I don't know, like a small town, and why do you always do this? Well, because it's always been done that way. I mean, you can't do it separately. Like, how would that even work?
We make certain assumptions and design, our lines certain ways. And it's always when we have interns or new hires that come in and they go, well, why do we do it like this? And you just saying, because that's how we've always done it, is not the best answer, because it means you could be missing out on some new study or not doing it the most efficient way, or over designing something. But yeah, there's always to some extent, oh, well, this is how I did on my last project, so that's how I'll do it on this one. And that's not the way. We try to not do that, but it happens.
Yeah, that kind of goes back to Chesterton's fence, where, the fence can't, in your circumstance, I'd say, well, look, we're doing it this way and the lines aren't falling down, so let's not mess with it. That's a decent reason to me. But on the other hand, it can be a barrier to change. So to someone like Debord, who is probably more of a revolutionary, he likes change. And someone like me who doesn't comes in and says, let's not change things too fast. Maybe the spectacle exists for a reason. Maybe getting rid of the spectacle doesn't improve society.
I guess a more superficial example of this would be like weddings. Like if you've been to one wedding, you kind of know what to expect at the next one you go to. Like, why does everybody carry flowers? Sure, there's traditions that you could trace back and give someone a factual, like, here's where we traced it. But really, I don't think anyone truly knows. It's just what you do. So you have, and that I guess too could go back to the predetermined choice. That's the way you assume it should be done. Like when you see other people's photos or you go to someone else's celebration, it self-legitimizes because it's a system you're familiar with. And if theirs was done like that and was good, yours is going to be good too.
And then in 13, he talks about how the means are simultaneously the ends, which kind of reflects back to 11, where the means of the spectacle, like maybe TV shows, for example, are also the ends, the things it's producing, or the brands and the images, which are the means, are also the things that's producing. It's its ends. And then he says, it's the sun which never sets over the empire of modern passivity. He's making a direct correlation to the British Empire. And this parallel to imperialism makes sense, because also in imperialism, the means and the ends are identical. Why do we need to have a military base in, India, if you're the British Raj or whatever? Well, it's because, it helps us protect our empire there. Well, why do we have an empire there? Well, we have a military base there.
And if it's the sun that never sets over the empire of modern passivity, it is because it is, and it will continue to be so.
I mean, it's there, it's eating itself.
14, I guess 13 is kind of reemphasized in that he says, really, he's saying these things are not accidents. The spectacle didn't just happen out of nowhere. It didn't just randomly evolve and take over. The society we live in is fundamentally spectaclist. And again, it's kind of created itself. And this was done on purpose. It says it's the visual reflection of the ruling economic order. Goals are nothing, development is everything, because the spectacle aims at nothing other than itself. So it's not this accidental force that has jurisdiction over people's lives. It was created, but is now also kind of separate without being separate.
It also has no end goal. It's not going anywhere. It's just perpetuating itself. It aims at nothing other than itself. It's just the continual perpetuation of production and consumption, production and consumption. And because he's a Marxian dialectical materialist who wants history to go somewhere, unfold and evolve and reach its end, this really bothers him.
Really, all he's saying in 15 is that the spectacle at this point is kind of indispensable. And it is actually the leading production of present day society, which I think just sums up everything he was discussing up until this point. The fact that it's images, it's visuals, it's experience turned into representation. And by this point, following his arguments, it should make sense that the spectacle is also the leading production.
Right. When we talked about the spectacle as the means and the ends, if you sum them all up, you just get the spectacle again.
16, his main argument is that humans, I guess, for lack of a better word, fall to the spectacle because they've already been subjugated to the economy. Humans as the means of production. The working class is already bound by the current economic situation, which is why the spectacle has an impact on them. And he says it is at once a faithful reflection of the production of things and a distorting objectification of the producers. So it's more of the circular reasoning with the spectacle just wrapping back around itself. But it works, according to Debord, because people have already been bound by the economy.
You're kind of, I guess he's saying you're born into it, so you can't help it.
17, I think, really gets at the heart of what he views the modern spectacle to be. And we get this idea of the transition from being to having, and then the transition from having to appearing. So the first one, from being to having, the exchange in that it used to mean something if you were this or that. Like maybe if you showed people that you were a good, kind person, meant something, like people saw that in your character. And then the having transition would be, instead of showing people who you are, you show people what you have to back it up. So maybe it's not that people can see you doing kind actions like volunteering service to others, but they see that you have service awards. So maybe you're being recognized for something that you have done. People haven't seen you do these things, but they see the results of your work in something that you now own. And then the last transition is to appearing. So the value now has shifted from being to having to now you technically don't need either of those things. You just need to appear to be it and to have it. So maybe before, where people would have seen you volunteer in your community, then they would have seen an award you won or some article in the paper about you. Now you post a picture on social media and you tag a charity organization. It looks like you are doing these good acts and you have merits that back it up, but that may not actually be true. And that shift, he says, is happening all over the place, and it's appearance based. And this, we also kind of we touched on this with the brand idea. We touched on this with technology. like appearing that you have something is now more important than having it itself.
And he's specifically tying those transformations to certain epochs of history. So he says the first phase, the domination of the economy, the degradation of being into habit. So before it was about, what did you do? I'm a farmer. I am a craftsman, an artist. And then it rather than turn from who am I to what do I have? That became the measure of who you were. It now became, oh, I have a big house and 2 cars. That's now who I am. And then as the spectacle has gained power, we slip into a appearing where rather than being about I have nice things, it's now about I appear to have nice things. Individual reality has become social reality, and individual reality is allowed to appear only to the extent that it is not actually individual reality. It just seems that way. He really seems to be down on the development of society this way. But my question is it really more fulfilling and a better life to spend all your time laboring than having leisure time in which you can contemplate things in society? I mean, agricultural laborers used to literally hibernate during the winter because they couldn't get enough calories to sustain them through it. And because of the modern capitalist system, we have leisure time now, which wasn't really a thing that existed before. And he complains about it because he sees it as just being a way that workers have their class consciousness zapped away. But if that were totally true, then we wouldn't be talking about this. We wouldn't be reading this thing that he wrote. So clearly the spectacle doesn't have the power to totally zap away all consciousness.
I guess that makes me wonder how he views himself in relation to the spectacle a little bit. Like if he's the person to write about it and to bring it to light for other people to discuss and to think about, does he still view himself as part of it? Does he view himself as surpassing it?
I mean, how has he escaped from it? Does he just view himself as just so intelligent that he's able to beat the spectacle? And I mean, at the time, he's in France in the 60s and 70s. It's not like various socialist and left-wing ideas like this are uncommon. I think they're dominant in the academy at this time in France.
His political movement, the Situationists, they would plan these things, and I'm trying to remember what they're called, but the best way I could describe it is like a planned experience. And the movement he was part of viewed resisting the spectacle as doing something that's not commodified on purpose. So today, I think it'd be the equivalent of, I'm going to go to the pumpkin patch with my friends or family and enjoy myself, but I'm not doing it for the gram, like intentionally. I'm not doing it for moments I can put online. Or I'm going to volunteer and do good in my community without posting about it on Twitter or Facebook. At least that's my take on the modern version of what he did back then. But I know this movement he was part of had all these little moments planned where they could get back what they felt was lost in the spectacle.
No matter what you do, it's part of the spectacle. But then, what does he view? Bringing it to light and talking about it. Does he think that's changing the spectacle? Or is he saying, haha, I've beaten it. If you go to the pumpkin patch and don't post about it specifically, then you're on your way to beating it too.
Yeah. Can you ever actually beat it if it really is as he described it?
In the Matrix, Neo escapes by taking the red pill, and then he becomes aware of the Matrix. Is that what he sees? The way you escape the spectacle is to become aware of it?
Yeah, because he's become aware of it.
If I'm aware that my choices are predetermined and I make them anyway, is awareness enough, or do you need to do something?
So many unanswered questions we have that will have to wait for part 2.
They will definitely
where they will
definitively answer.
It will be answered once and for all.
Thank you for listening to this episode of Left, Right, and Unwanted. Please tune in next time.